Welcome to Psyched for Psychology, a Nystrom & Associates podcast. Our hosts, Michelle Iverson and Brett Cushing, are both licensed marriage and family therapists at Nystrom & Associates. Each week, they talk about all things mental health and therapy, and you get a chance to dive into specific psychology topics that help promote personal development and wellness. And now, here are your hosts, Michelle and Brett.
Hello and welcome to another podcast edition of Psyched for Psychology. My name is Brett Cushing. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist with Nystrom & Associates.
And I'm Michelle Iverson, also a licensed marriage and family therapist with Nystrom. Thank you so much for joining us today. As always, our podcast has an email as well, too. It is podcast@nystromcounseling.com. We want to hear all of your feedback and comments and love to hear ideas for upcoming episode topics that you would be psyched to hear us talk about. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about sleep. But before we talk about sleep, we were actually just chatting for a little bit here, and we wanted to share, we heard some very interesting facts, not at all related to sleep, but really interesting facts that we both learned for the first time this week that we just wanted to share.
These are fun facts and highly relevant to our lives. So you'll see in a moment why this is so important to you. And you had one to begin with, right?
I had one about cats. And I'm going to have to admit, I know we've got listeners that are cat people. Personally, I am a dog person. We were actually just talking about our dogs a little bit ago. And I just had to share this one because I am a dog person. I think it's pretty funny about cats. So first time I ever heard this and before, apparently, did you know cats are capable of mind control? So as a therapist, I'm like, what? What do you mean? And apparently, research has found that cats can change the pitch of their meows to sound more like crying babies and manipulate us into giving them food and attention and more. So I'm not really a cat person, but I think if anybody knows their cat and knows their cat really well, I'd be really curious to hear if anybody else feels like, I think I know what they're doing, and they see that happening.
You know, it's funny because I don't know if I need research to realize this, but my dog does the exact same thing to me. And
so we gotta say dogs.
Right.
This is you too.
Yeah. And my kids and, everybody else, it seems. But yeah, that is rather interesting. And you see how relevant this information here on Psych for Psychology is for you. For me, I've got two. One, we just did our episode podcast on Friends with Ross and Rachel and the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, speaking Ross and Rachel from Friends. And I remembered a line that Chandler Bing brought up, and it's very important, thought-provoking. It's going to bake your noodle for the rest of the day. And that he made the observation, Donald Duck never wore pants. But every time he came out of the shower, he had a towel wrapped around him. And he just rhetorically asked, what's that about? Well, I have another fun fact. Actually, Michelle, you're the one that shared this with me. I love it. I can't get the picture of it out of my mind. Pigs are actually physically unable to look up into the sky. And I just keep getting this image of pigs yearning to look up like, no, I can't do it.
Me?
Just can't do it, And yeah, I know something's there, but I just can't do it. So we hope these fun facts are value added to your life. We are going to add some additional fun facts about something that's difficult for us to do sometimes in life. Sometimes we are just so tired that we just can't get through the day. We wonder how we're going to get through the day. Thank God there is coffee, and we have all these power drinks that are happening and available in so many different sizes, flavors, etc., which really underscore that we are tired. We are very tired people. So today we're going to be talking about sleep. And we're going to try and make this as concise and comprehensive as possible for you. So let's talk first. Why is sleep important? Well, think about this. We talk about research, and a lot of research we like to provide is very relevant and it's insightful. Some of it is just intuitive, like, of course. And here's one of them. The number one vulnerability factor we have for emotional vulnerability, that is when we get dysregulated emotionally, is a deprivation of sleep. So we kind of know that, but it helps to hear that again too, because it reinforces to us what I think we like to deny very often and just figure, I'm fine, I'm okay, I'll plow through, okay, I'll get an extra coffee. And yet it really is the number one vulnerability factor when it comes to our emotional well-being. So how much sleep do we need? And let's just try to be really practical about this, okay? It is about 7 to 9 hours of sleep. And now I can almost hear some of our people in our audience saying, yeah, I'm fine, I don't need that. Well, actually, we do. And we begin to not function optimally when we are below 7 hours. Now, optimally is the key word. We might be able to get through, but we're not really our best. We're not able to give our best. Not only at work, we're not able to give the best to the people who are most important to us. We're actually, we relate to ourselves throughout the day. And so we're not at our best even relating to ourselves. So really, about 7 to 9 hours are the hours we need. And there are very, very few people who can regularly function on less than 7 hours of sleep. A lot of people like to think they can, but there's very few who actually can. And so the other thing that's important for us on this is that people who might have more emotional sensitivity, people who might have emotional mental health diagnoses, probably need more close to 9 hours of sleep every day.
And how does it affect us if we're not getting that much? And that's a lot of us. Probably about 1 in 3 Americans are not getting enough sleep. So what does it do to us? So there's a number of things. When we think physically, like what happens to our bodies, even just a few nights of difficult sleep, it's going to take its toll. It doesn't have to be as much of an issue if it's occurring now and then. But for many of us, it's becoming a chronic pattern. And when we have chronic sleep issues, it's triggering a number of things, including higher levels of stress hormones in our body, which then triggers increases in our blood pressure, and that will affect our heart health. But then cognitively, how our brain works, even just one night of poor sleep is going to impact us. Both me and Brett, we have had many examples of times in which that might have happened to us too. So what happens to our brain? We start to show all of these symptoms and signs of things that somebody coming into our office and talking to us with, really, really kind of common issues that we would just do general treatment for. People will come in displaying anxiety and depression symptoms, mood swings, irritability. They'll come in with complaints of concentration, focus, memory, attention issues, and more. And sometimes it's asleep, where that's become an issue and that's starting to take a cognitive toll. We just really can't function as well at school, at work. We're actually even at more of a increased risk of a car crash.
Yes,
if we haven't had enough sleep.
I've heard that people who actually are deprived of sleep or they're starting to fall asleep, they are just as impaired as somebody who has had too much to drink. Yeah, that's a sobering thought.
Right. And for those clients that we see too, where they are dealing with other concerns like anxiety and depression, a lack of sleep is just going to pile on and add more. And even more things happen to us. Our bodies actually heal more slowly when we don't get enough sleep. Our body will create more white blood cells, which then creates an immune system imbalance. So then we experience immune system issues. And then our brain really needs time overnight to convert our short-term memories into long-term ones. And our brain really struggles to do that when we're not getting good sleep either. So what do we do? So there's actually a very specific type of therapy. We actually have a number of therapists here at Nystrom that are trained in this. It's called CBTI. It's short for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Insomnia. It's a specialized therapy, often short term, sometimes about 6 to 8 sessions. And all it does is addresses sleep. CBT, which I actually do quite a bit of work of in my practice, cognitive behavioral therapy, the basics of it is just what happens to us, how does that cause us to think a certain way, how does that affect how we feel, and then how does that affect how we behave. The CBTI says That really pertains to sleep and when we experience insomnia. This treatment says we got to change any unhelpful or inaccurate thoughts when it comes to our sleep and make sure that our behaviors are promoting really good sleep too. So what are some examples of that? CBTI might teach you something like this. Let's change your thoughts around sleep. So many people, if you are struggling with sleeping and falling asleep, might force themselves to stay in bed, even if they're not tired. They're trying to force sleep to happen, but then what that does is it creates this negative cycle of associating your bed with anxiety and with staying awake. Another thing CBTI might do is take a look at your behavior. How do we change behaviors that keep sleep from happening? So we are all often very guilty of doing things in bed that causes our brain to associate with being awake. For example, who hasn't just watched TV in bed, scrolled on their phone in bed?
Absolutely. Yes.
Absolutely. And so that's going to associate your brain with, I stay awake, I do these activities, I be active instead of sleeping. So CBTI, you learn that we need to change those unhelpful behaviors and essentially retrain the brain to associate our beds with sleep and sex and nothing more. So there's a lot more tools and techniques. That's just a very quick overview of what that treatment does, but it's very effective. Up to 70 to 80% of people with insomnia see improvements with that treatment.
Wow, that is so encouraging to hear that number, 70 to 80%, because so many of us are really struggling with sleep. And I want to add a few more tips for us and techniques we can use. Many of us don't realize that when we wake up in the beginning of the day, our body starts to create a chemical that actually will help us fall asleep at the end of the day. And that's a very good thing. However, when we take naps, and extended naps in particular, that stops that chemical from being produced, and then you sort of have to start over again. So if you are going to take a nap for maybe 30 minutes, definitely nothing more than an hour, because that disrupts that chemical and gets your circadian rhythm off. Like my circadian rhythm is I can come home from work at 9:15 and feel wide awake, but my body knows intuitively at 10 o'clock, I'm shutting down. And even when I want to sleep in and get more sleep, I still wake up at 6 o'clock. I don't even need an alarm clock. That's the circadian rhythm that we can set, which really helps us because our body is just kind of on autopilot. Now, we also want to share with you some additional things about sleep hygiene protocols. So, for instance, to increase the likelihood of a restful night's sleep, first of all, develop and follow a consistent sleep schedule, even on weekends. That's what I was just talking about. It sets that circadian rhythm. And so when we are doing work, let's say Monday through Friday, we get up and go to bed about the same time, hopefully. A lot of us like to really sleep in on the weekends. And the idea is continue that schedule throughout the weekend because it won't disrupt your circadian rhythm. And I also read this in, I think it was the Harvard Business Review, that when we do that, we actually feel as though our weekends are longer and we get more out of our weekends. We feel more restful after them as well. Number 2, do not use your bed in the daytime. Only use your bed for sleep. So try not to use your bed for watching TV, talking on the phone, or reading even. Try to use your bed only for sleep at night. Number 3, avoid, we're going to talk about this more in a little bit, but avoid the caffeine and the mood-altering substances. Number 4 is when prepared to sleep, turn off the lights. Keep the room quiet and the temperature comfortable and relatively cool. Number 5, give yourself half an hour to an hour at most to fall asleep. Takes a little bit of time, but sort of factor that in. So you might say, hey, I'm going to get 8 hours of sleep. You might want to factor in an extra half hour to actually fall asleep. Number 6, do not catastrophize. In other words, remind yourself that you need sleep, and aim for really resting your brain. And that's what we're trying to do is give our whole body, our brains even, a rest. Sell yourself on the idea that staying awake is not a catastrophe, right? And do not decide to give up on sleeping for the night and give up for the day. Now, what if you're calm, but you're wide awake? That is so frustrating. Have you ever had that happen, Michelle, where you're calm, but you're wide awake? So what do we do? Well, first of all, get out of bed. Go to another room. Maybe read a book. Do some other activity that will not wake you up even further, all right? So it's not a lot of stimulation. And then as you begin to get tired and sleepy, then go back to bed. And maybe you could try a little light snack at that time, and try not to get too upset that you're wide awake. Oh, I'm so mad that I'm awake. And just try to take it in stride, normalize it. That can happen sometimes. Get out of bed. Do something that'll help you just sort of distract yourself. Mm-hmm. So a couple other things we'll talk about. Do you have other ideas for us?
Yeah, I think that about covers like a lot of the what to do. Mm-hmm. But then there's some things to not do. The things in particular to avoid. And you actually touched on one of those already, alcohol. Lots of people, a number of people use alcohol to try and help them fall asleep.
Well, it does, Michelle. I mean, it helps me fall asleep. So why? I mean, I know it helps me fall asleep. So why wouldn't I want to do that?
So we know alcohol does do that. It induces sleep, starts that sleep, but the quality of your sleep goes way down, especially during the second half of the night. That entire sleep period, what alcohol is doing is actually increasing the number of times that you wake up later in the night when that relaxing effect is wearing off. And essentially, we're not getting that really good, deep REM sleep that we need either because of the alcohol in our system.
That's so frustrating because we think we almost need it to fall asleep, but then we pay for it later in the night. Yeah.
Yeah. And we really encourage that a lot of people seek help if they ever feel like they're becoming really dependent on the need for alcohol to help them to fall asleep.
That's a good point. You also, you've talked to me once about blue light. What is blue light?
So blue light is a light that is emitted from just about every electronic device, the ones that we love the most, our TVs, our computers, our phones. And that blue light is messing with our body's ability to prepare for sleep. It actually blocks a hormone called melatonin. I think many of us know about melatonin, like we can buy it from a store, but our body produces it too. It's part of sleep regulation. But this blue light that comes from everything we own is blocking it. And so there's a lot of recommendations for that on what to do. And a lot of it's hard. Like I'll admit, the first thing I'll talk about with clients is like blue light will really mess with your sleep. And this is a tough recommendation, but if we can turn off devices an hour before bed, that's what's going to help.
Ouch, that is
hard.
That is hard. I'm feeling the pain already. So I can't watch Netflix while I fall asleep at night. And honestly, I do that. And it's kind of like alcohol. I think it's going to help me fall asleep. And I've really never thought about this. I've thought, I need this to fall asleep. And yet I'm going to try over the next week doing exactly what you're talking about and just notice if there is any difference.
Absolutely. How about that idea of counting sheep? I thought this was a funny one as I was thinking about things to not do. I remember hearing about this study about that idea that if we count sheep, so many of us do it thinking it's going to help with our sleep. But back in 2002, Oxford decided, I don't know who decided this, but somebody at Oxford was like, we're going to study this. Like, does this actually help to count sheep? And so they actually split people into 3 random groups. One group was going to be the control group. So they were just going to do their normal routine, whatever they typically did for bedtime. The second group, they were asked to visualize a calming and tranquil scene, like waterfalls, while attempting to fall asleep. And the third group had to count imaginary sheep as they jumped over a fence one by one. what was so interesting that the researchers found, the people who were imagining the tranquil scenes got to sleep 20 minutes faster than they would on like other nights when they were just doing their normal routine. The people that were counting sheep took longer than usual to fall asleep. So lots of theories why, but what they were kind of coming up with was that maybe counting sheep is just kind of too boring for our brains. It might be that counting sheep causes anxiety at night. And maybe just that idea of visualizing a scene might require more energy for our brain and help that sleep happen sooner.
That's fascinating. I think for me what resonates is counting sheep may be too boring for the brain because it reminds me, and if people don't want to count sheep, you can do what I used to do. When I used to be a pastor, I would recall my sermon or my message that I was going to give because I figured it made everybody else fall asleep.
Oh, no.
And figure I'll try it on myself. And it worked, actually. I fell asleep. I think it was just too boring. So that resonates. Maybe counting sheep is just too boring. Maybe listening to my sermons are just too boring. But maybe boredom is the answer. And counting sheep, there's a lot of wisdom in that. Now, what about caffeine? We talked about how we drink caffeine throughout the day, and it's almost like we need it. How does that relate to sleep, though?
This kind of comes back to circadian rhythms and that melatonin again. If we drink caffeine too close to bedtime, it's going to reduce our sleep. There was a study that took a look at caffeine intake either right at bedtime, 3 hours before, and 6 hours before. Even that caffeine that was 6 hours before bed could reduce the sleep time by up to 1 hour. So 1 hour less of sleep if you had that caffeine even 6 hours before bed. And people that were getting caffeine right at bedtime or 3 hours before were reporting a lot of sleeping problems, but also didn't realize how much it was disturbing their sleep. So they say if you're having difficulty sleeping, really try to limit any of that caffeine intake at least 6 hours before bed.
Okay, so that means if I go to bed at 10, no coffee at 4 o'clock. What about chocolate? I mean, my Hershey bar with almonds at night that sets me free, Michelle. So are you saying, could that interfere because there's caffeine in chocolate, right?
Right. I don't know. I think that one I would probably bring it over to my doctor to be like, hey, you're going to have to help me out with this.
I'm going to need somebody. I'm going to need some help because I don't know if I want to go quite that far, but it might be the amount of caffeine that we're talking about. But that's highly relevant and helpful.
Right. Well, that brings up a good point, too. I think as therapists, we often that's part of why we wanted to do this podcast on sleep, actually, is because we often work with our clients on like anxiety and depression and all these concerns and issues, but sometimes we don't fully evaluate and talk with them about how is your sleep, right? That is such a basic need. And if that's not being met, could that be a contributor to a lot of the stuff going on? And I think that's the case for, doctors as well, too, wanting to talk with their patients about how is that sleep doing, because that could have a big impact on what they're experiencing physically too.
That's an excellent point that you brought up. And I know I work as a DBT therapist or a dialectical behavioral therapist. And with the patients I work with, we do something where we talk about a skill that Marsha Linehan had developed, and she developed DBT, called the please skill. And it's basically taking care of ourselves and being very intentional. Our physical needs, laughter, and which we did a podcast on with Dan Miller, and being intentional about our laughter in our life, and also being very intentional about our sleep, because we just sort of figure, I'm fine, I can take it, I can just drink a little more caffeine to get me through the day. And we're just kind of on survival mode, I think, a lot of times. So it's a good word for us, I think, as therapists to also consider that we need to be intentional about sleep and consider how much it really does interfere with our functioning.
And sometimes people will come to us as therapists to say, I have this really specific concern around sleep too. So we wanted to talk about some of those as well.
Yeah, that's good. And that CBTI training, I know, was very helpful for a lot of people here. So how about managing common sleep issues? Let's talk a little bit about that. And specifically, what about nightmares? right? Why do we have nightmares? How do I manage this? How do I overcome it? Well, here's some ideas that come from our curriculum that we use with dialectical behavioral therapy that was written by Marsha Linehan. What do we do when nightmares keep you from sleeping? First of all, practice relaxation. Practice thinking about and envisioning things that are pleasant and being ready to just relax and get yourself ready in a relaxed state. Some people like to listen to like spa music or a waterfall or something like that, but do some relaxation, do some deep breathing before you actually are going to be addressing your nightmares. So you're in a relaxed state. Then the second thing is choose a recurring nightmare that you would like to work on. You might have one that recurs again and again. You might have a few, but pick one that you want to work on and then write down your target nightmare. Write it down. Try to be as specific as possible. Include all of your sensory descriptions, in other words, the sights, the smells, the sounds, etc., and include any thoughts and feelings and assumptions you're having about yourself and everything else going on around you in that nightmare. Then choose a changed outcome for the nightmare. So now you're thinking, all right, what do I not like about the ending? And before you actually have a sleep episode where you're going to be having a nightmare, you're choosing ahead of time and thinking, what is the different outcome that I want to write, that I want to dictate, so to speak, so that I'm not sort of a victim of this nightmare that continues. So you choose that, you write it down, and you actually want to come up with this change that's going to prevent the bad outcome for yourself. And so you write it down in the full nightmare with all of the changes. Then you rehearse it in your mind and you relax each night before going to sleep as you rehearse that. Rehearsing it, the changed nightmare, by visualizing the entire dream with the changes each night before practicing your relaxation techniques, this is a game changer for us. So don't just write it down, come up with a new ending, but rehearse this and relax and continue to do that even during the day. Sometimes I've even done this when I wake up and I've had a bad dream or something's really unsettling and I wake up. What I've done is even just say, I'm not ready to start my day. I'm going to go back 10 minutes, and even if I can't fall asleep, I will sort of daydream and I pick up where I left off in my dream that I woke up with that was so disturbing, and I just finish it. I change the outcome in my mind. I get to write it, and I feel so much better at the end of that dream, and now I'm ready to start my day. So these are some nightmare protocols that you can do that Marsha Linehan recommends in her book.
And sometimes we get clients that will come into our office too that will have issues with night terrors. We're actually a little bit different. With night terrors, what's the difference? We're talking about more intense fear, including sometimes the person is screaming, thrashing around, but they also usually don't remember it happening. Usually remember our nightmares, but with these night terrors, they don't. Nightmares are more associated with like the vivid, like that dreaming stage of our REM sleep. But these night terrors happen at a different point. That's during the periods of the non-REM sleep when we're in a really deep sleep phase. We often see this more often in kids. Often they will just outgrow it as they get older and get into their teen years. But treatment is recommended if they're frequent and if they're causing concerns. And often treatment will focus on just making sure that sleeper is safe during these episodes and trying to find and eliminate any potential triggers. And sometimes too, we need to take a look at, especially as therapists, like, do we need to help you to get help to treat a possible medical issue that could be underlying this, or more of a mental health concern, like something like PTSD, and try to figure out what's going to be helpful to reduce stress and help the sleeper to recognize that their environment is safe too.
The other thing we can address here is bedwetting. Mm-hmm. Bedwetting is so frustrating for parents. It's anxiety producing for kids in particular. What do we do when there is bedwetting? First of all, what we want to do is have a child see a doctor to rule out any medical issue that's going on. And if a medical issue is ruled out, then we also want to consider there might be some trauma that's going on, and we want to explore that. You would want to explore that with a therapist and talk about trauma and different ways to treat that. I'm trained in EMDR therapy and find that to be very helpful for people. And then if it's not related to trauma, if it's not related to a medical issue, here's what I've really recommended is to sort of pivot, as parents, pivot away from it. Don't engage it because it causes a lot more anxiety. Mm-hmm. Don't continually bring it up because it's so anxiety producing for the child or even the teen for that matter. And what we can work on, though, in therapy is providing skills. How do we help ourselves to calm down? How do we deal with the anxiety that's going on about the bedwetting? And there are different things we can do. Ironically, a lot of people think that splashing yourself with water wakes you up in the morning, but actually holding on to some ice or putting your face into like a bowl of cold water actually has a diver reflex sort of occurrence within us where our body shuts down and helps us to fall asleep. And also developing other skills to help with anxiety that therapists can help with to bring down the anxiety and help us distract ourselves, and then also get into a good routine that we talked about earlier, and then give it time. Give it time. And this is what I tell parents is the child will stop this when they're ready. We just don't want to contribute to it by adding increased anxiety. Just help with skills, some deep breathing, some coping mechanisms, and it can resolve itself over time.
Mm-hmm. And the last one we want to talk about today, too, is sleepwalking. Again, more common in kids, often can just go away when they get older and become a teen. But again, treatment might be needed, especially if sleepwalking is causing injury, a particular danger to the person, or is otherwise disruptive. This is really similar to the same recommendations for night terrors. This person might even need a sleep study done. And so we really kind of recommend just, again, keeping that sleep environment safe, removing any potential hazards, knowing too it is okay to very gently lead them back to bed as well too. Many people are afraid what would happen if I were to accidentally wake them up, but it would be okay to be able to help them and lead them right back to bed.
I'm glad you mentioned that's a myth, right?
Yes.
And people are really afraid of that. And so we hope that you've been able to find some real practical interventions for yourself to help yourself, or maybe to help somebody else with some of these things. We've tried to give you things that you can do and things you may want to avoid.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So thinking about all of this, we covered a lot with sleep. Sleep is a big topic. And just like we said earlier, it's such a basic need. And we hope that hopefully a lot more people, 1 in 3 Americans, I'm hoping a lot more people get any help that they might need for this.
Yeah, we do hope that is the case, and we want to thank you so much for joining us today. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our Psych for Psychology podcast. We will have new episodes being released every Tuesday morning, and you can find us on any major podcast streaming platform, and you can follow us for our new episodes.
Again, please email us your comments to podcast@nystromcounseling.com and let us know any ideas for future topics that you would be psyched to hear us talk about. Thank you for joining. We're looking forward to talking with you again soon.
Thank you as always for listening, and please be sure to leave us a review. While this podcast can't be a replacement for therapy, we hope you enjoyed our discussion today and join us again next time. Nystrom & Associates is always available to those who are struggling. If you find yourself in need of support and help, please check us out at nystromcounseling.com.